Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name's John, and today we're going to be going over the Inferno, written by Dante Alighieri and translated by John Ciardi. We're going to be going over a couple different things. The first is going to be some background and context. Next, we're going to be going over some themes contained within the work, baked into Dante's work. Then we're going to be going over some highlights. So, what did I enjoy about the film, or about the book, and what did I dislike? What were some literary devices that I found particularly useful? And then finally, we're going to go over why you should read it, or if you should read it. So a little bit of background about the Inferno. Now, there are many book reviews on YouTube going over Dante, his life, going over the Divine Comedy as a whole. Probably do a little bit better explaining the background than I could. But just as a brief overview, the Inferno is one of three works that make up one larger work called the Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy itself is supposed to be Dante, who was a Christian, a Catholic, who was born in 1265 AD. His describing not just hell, I guess in the Inferno it would be just hell and allegorically representing the different aspects of hell. But the Divine Comedy in general is the descent through hell, ascend up through purgatory, which would be the cleansing and Catholic doctrine before you can enter heaven, and then eventually paradise or heaven after that. Now, Dante himself was born in 1265 AD in Florence, Italy, and he was born to a noble family, and so he was probably well educated, and he was Catholic, he was Christian, he was a believer in Jesus Christ. And as such, he likely had a very good theological upbringing, more than likely because of his heritage. And I'm not a historian or theologian, but there are two notable Catholic saints that actually died 10 years after he was born, and those two are Saints Thomas Aquinas and Saint Bonaventure. If you're not familiar with St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Bonaventure, they were a part of a very pivotal moment in the Catholic Church or Catholic history, where the church was starting to merge more intimately faith and reason, being able to reason logically for the existence of God or for some of the attributes that we attribute to God. And so it was a very, let's say, scholastically rigorous time that I'm sure Dante was exposed to. Now, there are also political strifes that were happening at the time. And again, it gets really difficult to parse out, but at a very high level, there were these two competing factions in Florence, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines were essentially not in favor of the Pope. They were in favor of a monarchy. And the Guelphs were in favor of the Pope's power over different nations. And Dante himself was a part of the Guelphs faction. And this wasn't just a political disagreement like you go and you argue and you talk in maybe a convene or something. This was pretty brutal. It was pretty brutal. People assassinating each other, killing each other. In the year after Dante was born, his political faction, the Guelphs, rose to power. They drove out the Ghibellines, they assumed political power, and now they're in charge. So Dante took advantage of this. He ascended the political ranks in Florence, and started being very influential. And like all things do, eventually there's some more infighting. The Guelphs started infighting with themselves, and there were two factions within the Guelphs, the whites and the blacks. So these two factions, and Dante, who was described by the author or the translator, John Ciardi, as more of a moderate, banned or exiled some of the more radicals on both sides, the whites and the blacks. And he does this, and then he leaves on a certain political campaign outside of Florence. And then one of I can't remember which one, if it was the blacks or the whites, one of the two assumes power and banish Dante, say, don't come back or we're going to burn you at the stake. So he's exiled at this point. And this is 1302 AD. This is about, I guess you would call it maybe smack dab in the Middle Ages. And that's when he begins writing the Divine Comedy. Now, when I started reading this book in particular, a couple years ago, 3 to 4 years ago, actually, when I first started doing book reviews, I didn't understand it. I couldn't access it. And I couldn't access it because I didn't quite understand the historical context around the book. Was he Christian? There are Greek mythology characters that are in the work, like Minos and Charon and Cerberus and the Harpies, and it's like, okay, I don't know, is this guy living in the 200 AD? I know he described Florence, but like I didn't know what was happening. So it took me a little while. I picked up again after reading notably the Bible and just getting a better historical sense of what happened in history. And for this book in particular, I started reading it out loud to my wife. And we would read each what's called a canto. And a canto is Italian for a song. I guess I should mention that this is not, you should not go into this reading this like a novel or something of that sort. It is a poem. It's a poem, and it should be read slowly, and you should try and reflect after each canto about what kind of themes or messages or allegorical representations is Dante trying to communicate to the reader. There are a lot of threes contained within the Inferno. This is one of three works that makes up a compendium called the Divine Comedy. There are 33 cantos, and a canto, for our intents and purposes, let's just assume that's a chapter. So there's 33 of those that make up each of the works. And then each of the cantos is split into stanzas, which have 3 lines that have a certain rhyme scheme and are also written in iambic pentameter. Now, 3 works, 33 cantos, stanzas with 3 lines. All these threes are meant to harken back to the triune God, the triune Christian God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's also meant to harken back to a cathedral, because there are 3 different sections of a cathedral. Now, in the Inferno, Dante is essentially describing himself as waking up in a dark wood. That's how the work begins. I find myself alone in a dark wood. Basically, he finds himself lost, and he's afraid of this wood. This wood is so dreary, and it gives it a life to fear. And what he's trying to explain is that he's lost his way. He's off the straight and narrow. He's off the beaten path to righteousness, to heaven, and he's found himself in sin, in doing the wrong things he might know are not right. And he's afraid. He doesn't know how to get back on the straight and narrow, let's just say, in back in God's grace. And after he finds himself alone in this dark wood, this poet named Virgil, who's a Roman poet, finds him. And Virgil tells him he was sent by this character named Beatrice. And I won't go into who Beatrice is, but Beatrice is supposed to represent, you're supposed to think about divine love or divine light. Divine love sends Virgil to Dante in this dark wood and says, I'm meant to save you and bring you to heaven, but first we have to descend through hell, go up through purgatory, and then we can reach paradise. And those are the 3 sections of the book. If you're not familiar with purgatory, it's a Catholic doctrine that outlines the purification of a soul before it can reach heaven. So that's why you have these three sections in these 3 works. Now, a lot of the more common book reviews will go over how, I guess the quote is very metal. There are a lot of very powerful and descriptive outlines of hell, or the tortures that are going on in hell as Virgil leads Dante down through hell. And as they go down through hell, the descriptions get more egregious, and the torments get more intense. And these descriptions of hell are supposed to do a couple different things. One, they're obviously supposed to enact some emotional or visceral response, because he uses a lot of very, not only does he describe like visually what's happening, but he describes by appealing to a number of different sensory emotions. The first one being sight, and then you have smell and hearing. What sounds is he hearing? And then he explains to us or communicates his own kind of visceral feelings about looking through these different tortures. And it's not just supposed to be him kind of saying, ha ha, oh, look at these sinners, like they're horrible. It's supposed to be a representation of the Christian ideal of coming to grips with your sin, of acknowledging things or ways in which you've come short. And this is a Christian ideal, but this is an ideal for most people. I mean, when we find we've come up short and you eventually apologize, you have to first recognize you've done something wrong, that you've wronged somebody, that you've done something that needs reparation in some way, reparation through an apology or making amends by doing something for that person. Most people think that. And I think in Christianity, not only is that that explicitly you're supposed to do that. You're called to forgive so that you can also be forgiven. But you have to ask for forgiveness, not only to other people, but from God. And so there are ways in which that is enacted through the sacraments and notably through confession. And so in confession, when you go in, you verbally are professing the sins you have committed since your last confession. You are coming face to face with them in a very real and intimate way by speaking them to another person, namely a priest. And so it's basically one big, I don't want to say it's one big description of this process, but that is a big theme that is embedded in the work. And you don't have to be Christian, like I mentioned, to come to grips with and relate to this kind of idea. Now, again, the descriptions are pretty intense. The descriptions do make you kind of, curl your nose, kind of look away. I read this out loud to my wife, and there are many times where we kind of like look at each other and kind of squint and kind of maybe are a little uncomfortable with some of the descriptions. Now, one of the descriptions is when Dante gets to the bottom of hell, he meets Satan. Satan's at the bottom. And Satan is frozen in a lake, and he has large leathery bat wings, and he's beating his wings. And as he beats his wings, a gust of wind is freezing the lake and freezing people, or let's say sinners, in the water in different contorted positions. Satan himself has 3 faces, and he is weeping, he's crying, while each one of his faces is chewing on Brutus, Cassius, and Judas. Now, Brutus and Cassius are supposed to be, in history, they're the ones that betrayed Julius Caesar. And Judas is one of the first of the 12 apostles who betrayed Jesus in the Gospels. And so betrayal is the ultimate sin that will get you to the bottom of hell and Dante's, I guess, let's say, theological outlook, right? I think when a lot of people think about, it's a little bit jarring when you think about the devil as crying in a lake full of ice, stuck in this ice, and not lava, fire, and brimstone. And there's some lava, fire, and brimstone in there if you're kind of looking for that. But there's a lot of ice, there's a lot of snow, there's a lot of these kind of ideas. But people are kind of taken aback and we were taken aback to a certain extent when we read this, right? Because it's not very intuitive. But I think that kind of undergirds the central theme of the book, or one of the big themes of the book, is that if God is all goodness, if he's everything good, infinitely good, everything that is good that comes through him, then Satan would be not the absence of all good, because he's a creature, he's a created being, and being itself is good. Created beings are good. And so I always think about that scene when Anakin is about to fight Obi-Wan. And there's a scene when he has the Sith eyes. His eyes are now red, and he's in the dark side of the Force, let's say, and his face is red. But he's crying. He has tears coming down his face. And why does he have tears coming down his face? Why doesn't he have just, infinite rage and hatred? And why do we, when we get super angry, when people get angry, do we start to, well up with tears? And I think, okay, you can make a case if it's just like, this or that physiological pathway that is, being activated, whatever. But I think there's a case of like, when you're that rageful and envious and you're ultimately hurt, there's something broken and missing that is fueling this rage. And I think it's apt. that would be the description of Satan in hell. Now, what are some of the aspects that I particularly enjoyed about the Inferno? Now, one of the literary devices that he uses in this book in particular is when he wants to describe something that's particularly egregious, or something that he wants you to think, oh, wow, he did that on purpose. He uses particularly coarse language when he wants to describe something. And by coarse language, I mean cuss words. He cusses. He uses curse words. And he does this because it makes you stop. Like there are some pretty intense descriptions throughout the entire book, but it's usually like, I don't want to say flowery prose, but flowery prose. It's elegantly written. And at certain points, namely a couple points in the book, he'll put in a cuss word, and he'll basically make not only a cuss word, but he'll make the description particularly egregious, and it makes you stop. And I mentioned that way. I read this out loud to my wife, and there are portions you'll come to when you read it, and you'll stop, and you'll kind of like, what was that, a typo? Did he do this on purpose? And the translator of this in this copy in particular says, no, he does this on purpose. The author purports that this gives Dante the nickname as Master of the Disgusting. And I liked it not because it's just for the sake of it being disgusting or gross or anything like that, but it really did the job. There are parts where you're reading the book and you stop, your eyes widen, maybe you're getting a little to sleep and you have to wake up again like, whoa, that was different. And so I really did appreciate that. Now, one of the big flaws, let's say criticisms I have about the book, are one that you'll find in a couple different places. Like I mentioned, Dante was very proud of being from Florence and loved his where he was from. Because of that, because of the political hotbed that he was in, he embedded some of the political undertones. I won't even say they're undertones, they're overtones into his work. And particularly if there was a person who was a political rival or someone he didn't like, he would basically put them in one of the levels of hell being tortured and then describe how he saw them and that how he spoke to him or something like that. It kind of at times made, well, I guess there's two levels to this. The first thing is, I don't know any of these 1200 AD political people, and I don't really care about them, and it kind of takes you out of the world when they mentions one of them, like by name, and you don't know this name, you don't know this person, why do they matter? And it's, it kind of takes you out of the world for a bit, which is not the greatest. And the second thing is, it kind of can at times come off as a political hit piece. And it's because in the notes, at least, the translator, John Ciardi, mentions how some of the allegations, he has no idea. There's no historical basis for why Dante would say that. For instance, he calls actually a lot of people sodomites by name. And, this guy's a sodomite. He's a sodomite. Everybody's sodomite. And the author will say, I don't know why he's saying this. There's no reason, there's no historical reason or basis as far as we can tell why he's calling these people these things or why he's saying that they committed X, Y, or Z and they're in hell. And, that comes off, I feel like that to me says that he's just trying to, take shots at people, which, fine. It's his work. He can do what he likes. But again, it's just another layer of taking the reader out of the world you're building, because you're kind of putting in contemporary, or at least at the time, contemporary aspects into the book. It's like if someone were to write this again and, they didn't like, I don't want to say anybody in particular, but they didn't like a particular political figure of the time of our day to day, and they put them in the book. So, okay, now it's like propaganda. Now it feels like propaganda. And so that's kind of what I felt at times. I wouldn't say it's the whole book, but it is a substantial portion of the book, which it wasn't the greatest. Now, who is this book for? I would say this book is for everybody. All the political hit piece and those kind of aspects aside, it is a very good book. It is a very good book. The prose is, I'm not sure if anybody watching has heard of Bishop Barron, but Bishop Barron describes it as a gallop. It seems like a gallop, like you're galloping through the world that Dante wrote, and it's very well written. It's a little weird at times because, again, if you go into it like a novel, it's going to read it doesn't read like a novel. And if you come to grips or kind of custom with the pace at which he's writing, you feel like you're being carried along on a gallop through the book, and you're just being shown different things, and it's very pleasing to read. It doesn't take that long. Again, 33 cantos. Each canto is not very long. And this translation by John Ciardi is very good. I know it got reprinted into a better kind of looking book. This one has tape on it and whatnot. And that one probably also is very good. So anybody who likes works that you can kind of sit with, if you like poetry, if you like things that maybe are not on the nose all that they seem, that you have to kind of reread, and kind of sit with, think about, maybe talk about for a little bit. If you like particularly poignant descriptions in books, now these aren't obviously all good descriptions, but they are descriptions that are vivid, that appeal to your senses, that really make you not only just read it and are told it, but you almost smell it, you almost hear it, you almost feel the different sensations that Dante's going through. I think it does a great job at that. It does a fantastic job. In my opinion, I would give this probably an 8.5 out of 10. I definitely very highly recommend it. If you like this book review and you want to get this earlier, I have a Substack that I can have linked down below, where I do book reviews just like this. The first one's on Dante and the Inferno. If you like these book reviews and want to stay up to date and want to get notified as soon as they come out, feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching.